Good morning. This video recording is being made for the benefit of the family of the deceased, of Muhammad Abdul Rida Salim. The text will be translated into Arabic. The paragraphs I shall read from are in the full report in a section called A Summary of the Findings and Conclusions Regarding the Death of Mr. Salim. The earlier paragraphs in the report contain a recital of the principal parts of the evidence in some detail, and there is also comment there. This part, which I am about to read, contains more detail than that which would normally be expected in a summary. But that is because the family should have as much detail as they can in Arabic for their consideration. This section refers back to evidence and to reasoning in the earlier part of the report. If resort was needed to that, then that would have to take place from the report, which will be available on the website. Part 1 is called the narrative account. The written and oral evidence establishes to my satisfaction that at approximately 23:15 hours on the 5th of November 2003, an Arab male came to the guard room at Camp Cherokee and deliberately supplied false information about a group of armed men having entered a private house not far from the camp, who were planning an operation against the British forces. Unknown to the British forces at the time, and revealed only in the course of this investigation, the informant was Khaled al-Badani, who had a close connection to the interpreter who was on duty at the camp that night. They were members of the al-Badani tribe. The interpreter introduced the informant as an acquaintance and a taxi driver. The informant gave information through the interpreter to SO-12, the acting intelligence officer at the camp, and again to Major Routledge, the OC, to the effect that a party of 10 to 15 men had broken into a house armed with long-barreled weapons, grenades, and RPGs, and were planning an operation against the British forces. He could well have also stated, as SO-12 recalls, that the occupants had been taken hostage. Major Routledge, accompanied by SO-12, SO-13, the platoon commander, and the interpreter, with Khaled al-Badani driving his taxi, drove slowly past the house in question. The purpose of the recce was to confirm the location, the layout, and to get an idea of the best way in and out of the building. There were no indications of armed activity at the location, save that SO-13, but not Major Routledge or SO-12, recalls that someone stated that at least one individual with a long-barreled weapon was on the roof of the house. On the evidence, if said, it seems likely to have come from Khaled al-Badani or the interpreter. I dismiss it as unreliable evidence, which I'm satisfied had little or no impact on the decision which was made by Major Routledge to mount the operation. On the return to the camp, Major Routledge gave quick battle orders for a search and arrest operation against the target house. The security situation prevailing at this time was seriously affected by the activities of terrorists, riots, tribal infighting, and high levels of criminality. There had been extensive proliferation of former Iraqi army-held weapons and ammunition. The intelligence records, which, had they been available, would have been relevant and helpful, were left behind in Basra for operational reasons. Such action should be avoided in the future unless no other option is available. There would have been an operations room logbook into which intelligence from informants was recorded. SO-12 was the intelligence officer, but he had not been trained as such. Secoy had no central intelligence cell and thus had tasks for its AOR allocated to it. Notes, war diaries, and other documents would have been collected into a pack. No such records have been available. In circumstances differing from those with which I'm concerned in this case, the absence of intelligent records might have mattered. Written contemporaneous records of the receipt of intelligence could have been of critical probative value in establishing the reason for the search and arrest operation. However, since there's been evidence from the family of the deceased, which has confirmed that false information was given to the British forces, and the identities of those responsible have been made known, I have been able to be sure about the reason for the decision taken by Major Routledge. I have no reason to doubt that the information justified a high degree of concern, presented a potential threat to the British forces, and called for an immediate decision to be made about what course of action was appropriate. In a situation where an anarchic breakdown of law and order had occurred, and there was continuing armed violence, it was not open to Major Routledge to do nothing. A decision to carry out a search and arrest operation was, in the circumstances, reasonable and not hasty or irresponsible. But a search and arrest operation on a house where it is believed armed occupants could be present requires planning so as to achieve a balance between the degree of force that should be used to enter the building, the risk to which soldiers could be exposed as they enter the building, and measures for the safety and interest of the occupants of the building in the event the intelligence proves to be false. A soft knock involving the British forces making known their presence vocally was contemplated and ordered by SO-13. But necessarily there had to be flexibility to meet circumstances as they occurred. The locked gates and the need to use force to gain entry to the courtyard changed the circumstances. It is likely the gates to the courtyard were locked because of the security threat prevailing generally, as well as the threats to which the family had been put by the al-Badanis. Had communication been established before entry, I'm confident that the perceived threat to the British forces would have been reduced by the response or by the occupants. A search would no doubt have ensued, but there would have been no circumstances calling for force to be used against the occupants. Such conclusions can be reached only with the benefit of hindsight. I accept the evidence that the forced entry through the gates exposed the soldiers, who had to gain entry into the house, to a potential degree of risk, which made a forced entry into the house a reasonable measure to adopt. I've had in mind, in my consideration of the tactics and the planning, that the involvement of the interpreter in his introduction of the so-called walk-in are likely to have had an influential bearing on the weight given to the credibility of the information. Given that it is now known that Khalid al-Badani and the interpreter were acting so as to induce action by the British forces against the house, they must have played an influential role in creating the perceived need for action by the British forces. There was a paucity of information, there was a paucity of evidence, but the source, supported by the interpreter, added to its credibility. Steps which might have been taken to verify the information could have included, in other circumstances, enlisting the assistance of the Iraqi police. However, in the state of affairs in Basra at this date, that is not likely to have achieved much. I do not believe recording the identity of the informant, which might be a sensible course in general to adopt, would have made much difference, since the informant had been introduced as an acquaintance of the interpreter. Retaining an informant until after the completion of a search and arrest operation might in many circumstances amount to a safeguard, but on the facts of this case it would have made no difference. It has been said that ascertaining whether there were armed men at the target location should have taken place before executing the operation. The decision to attempt a soft knock operation was designed to achieve that end. There's been a body of evidence from the British forces which is not in all respects consistent about whether shots were fired from within the house at or about the time the soldiers entered the house. I shall come to this topic later. The family have denied there were shots fired in the house. Whether there were any shots fired, as among others SO11 has maintained, is highly material to the likely state of mind in which SO11 was acting when he shot Mr. Salim. My conclusion on this question forms part of the critical dispute about what circumstances existed at the time Mr. Salim was shot. It requires my conclusions on the credibility, reliability, and accuracy of the eyewitnesses to be set out. Conclusions on evidence from the family. The evidence from the family set out in this report demonstrates that until this investigation began, each of them had portrayed the fatal shooting of Mr. Salim as having taken place in the following circumstances. 1. The family members being present together in Ramadan to eat and enjoy the intimacy of their family life, in peace and security, sitting normally, having dinner. It was stated that, as part of our tradition as Muslims during Ramadan time, we get visitors and visit relatives during the night time. It happened that night we were visited by Mr. Salim. We were sitting, enjoying our time and eating fruit. That prior to his arrival, Mr. Salim had telephoned on the landline to say that he and his family would be coming round. That this was entirely normal. That when he arrived, he explained that FZD, that is Fatima, had stayed behind to help the children with their homework. 2. The family members were sitting in the hall when the soldiers started the assault. Mr. Salim was in the hall when he came face to face with the soldier. Alternatively, he may have moved to climb the stairs and was coming back down when he was shot. There was an interpreter present who seemed shamed that MZD, a well-known and respected local lawyer, should have been treated in this way. 3. Mr. Salim had moved to the stairs when the exterior gates were broken through. He was alone on the stairs, on the second or third stair. AIS may have moved towards the stairs, but the suggestion that there were 2 men on the stairs was untrue. 4. The family were an unarmed family simply enjoying a meal. There were no guns in the house. MZD had previously owned a gun, but it had been stolen in a burglary. 5. The family had no idea why their house had been targeted. They requested an inquiry to disclose the reasons why the house had been targeted. 6. They acknowledged that the British forces said that they had made a mistake because they had received false information from an unknown person, but limited their comment to a complaint that the British forces should have acted upon it. They drew attention to a variety of consequences, including tribal differences with Mr. Salim's tribe, the need for MZD to settle the tribal differences, and a change in the attitude of Mr. Salim's family to FZD, with whom it was said they had not maintained a good relationship. MZD asserted that all these problems had been caused by the British forces, and he claimed to be compensated for them. Shortly after this investigation commenced, in August 2015, MZD and FZD volunteered a joint statement to PIL, which was expressly stated to serve as a record of the particular circumstances they regarded as relevant to their claims. To matters which have been previously raised, they drew attention to a threat made by a person who had threatened revenge against them. A complaint was advanced that despite the fact that they'd given the name and address to the British forces who had visited the address, the British forces failed to interrogate or arrest the person. In truth, the British forces had visited the Al-Badanis, not because of a threat, but because MZD had stated they had attacked the house. They deliberately avoided mentioning the drive-by shooting and portrayed the informant and the person who had threatened them as different persons. After the details of the British forces' account had been supplied to them by the IFI, and the relevant documents in support had been supplied to MZD through QC Law, MZD reviewed them. The results of his review were recorded and supplied to the investigation. MZD's comments reflect his experience as a lawyer. They are detailed and contentious. His review of the documents, which I understand he had not seen before, resulted in substantial changes being made to the account previously given. He would have appreciated the probative value of the written record, which included facts that could only have come from himself or his wife. The changes which he made contradicted many assertions which had been central to the earlier posture which had been taken. 1. MZD accepted the account referred to in the PIR that he'd been subject to an armed attack earlier in the evening when the exterior of the house had been sprayed by bullets. As I find, he had resolutely and deliberately failed to refer to this event in any earlier account. He had disingenuously attempted to reduce the event to a mere threat that he had communicated to the British forces, which led to a visit being made by the British forces, when in truth the visit had been made because he had informed the British forces of the feud and the attack. Whilst he had mentioned the tribal feud with Mr. Salim's family to support his claim for compensation, at that time he made no mention of the tribal feud, which had been the cause of the British forces' raid that night. For the first time, it became clear that far from having no idea why the British forces had raided, the family knew or believed that the al-Badanis had given false information to induce the raid. The interpreter, who in the 2013 statement had been reported as being shamed by the conduct of the British forces, had played a central part in deceiving the British forces. In the circumstances, I consider suggestions made by MZD that he was seen by Mr. Salim's family and in the community generally to be the person responsible for the death of Mr. Salim to have been contrived. In circumstances where he knew and everyone else concerned to know would also have known that the al-Badanis were to blame, the suggestions are not plausible. 2. MZD identified Khalid al-Badani as the person who had misled the British forces, and the interpreter who came on the raid with the British forces as a member of the same tribe. 3. MZD confirmed the existence of the feud and that it was over offices in Basra. 4. MZD suggested that Khalid had gone to the camp to give false information after the drive-by raid and in order to mislead the British forces. 5. MZD stated, contradicting his earlier repeated assertion that Mr. Salim was alone on the stairs, that both IAS and Mr. Salim were on the stairs. 6. MZD contradicted his earlier assertions that there were no weapons in the house and revealed that there were 2 AK-47s in the house. I reject the attempts he made to explain why he had said in his 2013 statement as a misunderstanding and as to whether it was guns or rifles which were being referred to by the questioner. It is clear to me that he set out, when speaking of the burglary, to provide a reason why there were no weapons, which enabled him later in the statement to assert that they were an unarmed family simply having a meal. As he stated when giving evidence by Skype, they were a family who had deliberately armed to counter an attack they expected from the al-Badanis. 7. The revelation of these facts followed MZD's review of the British forces' material. The revelations confirm large parts of the British forces' account of the circumstances, but whether Mr. Salim was armed with an AK-47 must be resolved. 8. It emerged from his Skype evidence that Mr. Salim had telephoned on a landline to say he was coming round, not because of his normal habit of visiting, but because he'd heard about the drive-by shooting and wanted to know how things were. It is not surprising that in those circumstances FZD and the children did not come round. Contrary to the earlier account, AIS had not come round because it was Ramadan and because he wanted to enjoy a meal. He came round to provide help and protection, knowing that MZD was taking steps to arm himself against another attack. 9. When the crash to the gates took place, contrary to the earlier account, it was asserted that IAS went first and mounted the stairs, and that Mr. Salim followed. MZD gave somewhat confusing evidence about whether or not AIS picked up the AK-47, which was a loaded rifle, when he reached the top of the stairs. But AIS, in his statement, dated the 20th of November 2015, said he did pick up the AK-47, but put it down again when Mr. Salim called out, "They are British soldiers." MZD accepted that when the front gates were crashed, he assumed that it was return of the Al-Badanis. I'm satisfied that a similar belief was likely to have been shared by AIS and Mr. Salim. For that reason, reference had been made in the Routledge letter to the belief that they were subject to an attack from criminals. I've considered these changes in evidence, reminding myself at every stage of the problems which can arise when statements are made in one language in answer to questions posed in another, and where the scope for misunderstanding through interpretation can arise. I have also had in mind that the process of making a statement would have been strange to them all, and that the content could well have been driven by the questions posed, with limited elaboration from the interviewee. I have weighed all these factors, but I'm left having little or no confidence in the reliability of the family's evidence. MZD is an experienced lawyer, and it is clear that he's applied his experience to the exercise of providing his account, and where he has wished to do so, he has elaborated on the facts. There are too many contradictions on important matters and details. For example, why the family were together that evening, whether Mr. Salim was on the stairs alone, and whether the family had weapons in the house. The failure to mention the drive-by raid until the last minute was deliberate. The false translation. My confidence in the reliability of the family evidence has also been seriously undermined by the existence of the false translation of the Routledge letter. I've already given my reasons for concluding that the omissions and additions were deliberate. They were contrived to remove blame from the Al-Badanis and to focus blame on the British forces. MZD explained his part by stating that the Arabic version was provided to him by the uncle of Khalid al-Badani. Produced this letter to put the blame, ... Even the British themselves acknowledge they mistakenly did what they did. So not our fault. This was done as part of an effort to resolve the tribal conflict. I do not believe that MZD created the false translation. It seems likely that the interpreter would have done it in the interest of the cause of the Al-Badanis. It's not entirely clear how they thought the Arabic version could help, unless it was to be used as some form of public notice that the Al-Badanis had nothing to do with it. Supplying it to MZD would not achieve much. I was informed by Pill that MZD had asked for a translation from Major Routledge. Major Routledge had no recollection of being asked. If the purpose was to acquit the Al-Badanis, then that purpose would have been assisted by the translation being lodged in the Al-Makal court. I have been informed it was lodged shortly after the 9th of November 2003. MZD was party to that happening. MZD had commenced proceedings seeking the Al-Kamal's court's assistance in tracking down the informer. It would not have been proportionate to attempt to carry out a collateral inquiry into all the circumstances surrounding the creation of the false document, or the use to which the false evidence was or could have been put. It has nevertheless appeared significant that the strategy adapted by the family to keep the Al-Badanis out of the picture and only to admit their involvement when it was felt that revelation was required is entirely consistent with the stated purpose for the creation of the document. It was in aid of a strategy to place blame for all the consequences of the incident on the British forces. The first portrayal of the facts by the family involved a concerted effort to place everyone in the hall when the soldiers attacked. This version avoided a need to explain why Mr. Salim was on the stairs, but the version was subject to contradiction by the content of the police report that there was blood on the stairs. Thus, later, there was a concerted and deliberate effort to maintain that Mr. Salim was alone on the stairs. This account only changed in the face of the detail from the material supplied by the IFI. The account, which was consistent with the terms of the false translation, had been tenaciously held to by MZD, who said that the Routledge letter was untrue in stating there were two men on the stairs. After it had been accepted there were two guns in the house, and evidence was given that AIS held one of them, emphasis was placed on the agility of AIS to mount the stairs and be in a position to pick up a gun, which, unlike the AK-47 said to be under the stairs and unloaded, was loaded. The acceptance introduced at the last minute that there were guns in the house. Read that again. The acceptance introduced at the last minute that there were guns in the house contradicted the forceful, repeated, and deliberate assertions to the effect that they were unarmed. I reject the attempt by MZD to explain his denials in the 2013 statement that there were no weapons in the house as arising from translation difficulties. He was clear in his assertions. He elaborated by reference to the burglary, and he stated that they were an unarmed family. The account now given is so far removed from the earlier portrayal of the circumstances surrounding the fatal wounding of Mr. Salim that I am unable to accept the evidence of the family, both on the issue as to whether there were shots fired within the house and whether Mr. Salim was armed with an AK-47 when he was shot. Notwithstanding this conclusion on the family evidence, I must now consider the credibility, accuracy, and reliability of the British forces' evidence. Conclusions on the evidence of the British forces. The British forces' account lacked independence, being from the military command, and for that reason it requires scrutiny, so that one can be sure that there's been no attempt to cover up the facts, nor to present a self-serving account of events. Whether SO11 was acting within the rules of engagement when he shot Mr. Salim. The PIR and SO11 statement was prepared almost immediately and certainly within the first available opportunity that existed. On the other hand, no photographs of the scene were taken, although a sketch plan was made by SO13. Had photographs of the guns found in the house been taken, the record would have been more definitive. Although a statement was made by SO11 within 24 hours or less, no statements were obtained from the other members of the patrol, and in particular no statements were taken from the two Kingsmen who had entered the house immediately behind him or beside him. The references to Kingsmen Morris and Jones have not in the event proved to be the source of any evidence. Since neither of them gave evidence to the investigation that they did witness the shooting of Mr. Salim, I accept the submission made by the family that I should make my findings on the presumption that neither was present when the shooting took place. Accordingly, the only eyewitness to the shooting were SO11, AIS, MZD, and EZD. I make my findings on the basis of their evidence, inferences to be drawn from the surrounding facts and circumstances, and witness testimony from others who were present either shortly before or after the event. SO13 and Andrew Price have been able to provide detailed evidence and have done so from their recollection 12 years after the event, save that SO13 was able to identify his sketch plan. Although the PIR and the WKDB and extracts from the radio logs have been available, full documentation, including the intelligence logs and records, were left behind. There are inconsistencies, in particular in connection with the record made of the number of shots fired and when they were fired. But I have received evidence that the ends of strict accuracy of reporting are not always met by a radio log process, where accuracy and complete understanding can be the victim of misunderstanding and the garbling of messages. Time lags also occur, so that recorded timings cannot be taken as being precisely accurate. That said, although I have not taken the recorded times as being precise, the records are a reliable source of time lag between events. Notwithstanding the above, I am satisfied that the time in which the records were made include the statement by SO11 did not permit of fabrication or collusion. A full incident report was called for by 12 p.m. today. Far from attempting to cover up facts or present a partial picture, Major Routledge wrote and apologized, accepting that he had made a mistake. I reject with confidence any possibility that he wrote a dissembling letter when he conveyed his condolences. It might have been better, in the light of events, had he stated that Mr. Salim was armed with an AK-47. But I accept his explanation that he had not set out in the letter to give a full account of every detail, but to provide a proper explanation and to apologize. He was writing to an eyewitness with whom he'd already had a conversation about the incident. I understand his observation that it was self-evident to make the point. Further, I'm satisfied that it would not have been plausible for him to advance the suggestion that fully armed soldiers who had entered the house and encountered an unarmed man could have believed there was a contact underway, or, as Major Routledge stated, a soldier could have thought he was in danger. I have concluded that Major Routledge wrote in the terms he did in the hope that his letter would provide an accurate explanation, show his respect for the family and regret for the loss of life which had occurred, as well as to provide some comfort to MZD and the widow of Mr. Salim. EZD recalls SO11 apologized to her in the house. He apologized again on the occasion of the video hearing. I am deeply, deeply sorry for the family, the widow, and if I could change anything or go back in time, I'd do it, and I'm sorry. I'm satisfied that he was not apologizing for having shot an unarmed man, but for having shot an armed man who, contrary to SO11's belief at the time, did not present a risk. His words, which were marked by their spontaneity, reflect regret born of the wisdom of hindsight. Knowing now that Mr. Salim was a respectable and valuable schoolteacher who would not have shot a British soldier, if he could go back in time, he would now act differently. I'm satisfied on all the evidence that Mr. Salim was armed with an AK-47 as he ran downstairs ahead of AIS, who was also armed with an AK-47, and that SO11 encountered him as he was moving through the hall from the front door, and encountered him within seconds of having entered. Notwithstanding the above conclusion, I have to consider other aspects affecting the immediate circumstances of the confrontation. It is clear that false information upon which the raid was launched must have operated on the mind of SO11. He had entered the house having grounds for holding a reasonable expectation that he could meet hostile armed combatants. There is no evidence that he should have realized by the time he was confronted that in truth he'd entered a house of a respectable family where the occupants harbored no intention of engaging the British forces. I'm satisfied that his belief that he was in danger was in truth wrong, in that Mr. Salim had no intention to harm him. But his belief was based upon the sight of a respectable schoolteacher who had armed himself to protect the family from the Albadanis, and whose demeanour and carriage would have been, at immediate sight, potentially hostile and a threat to him. I've spoken earlier of the malign impact of the Albadanis. Had they but limited their criminality to the giving of false information, Mr. Salim would not have been armed with an AK-47. He was armed because the Albadanis had carried out an armed attack and had forced MZD and his family to resort to an armed defence. The other aspect which has been in issue is whether there were 5 to 6 shots from an AK-47 fired within the house at or about the time the soldiers entered through the front door. The contemporary logs appear to record that at 0034 hours, 5 to 6 rounds of fire took place at them, namely the soldiers entering the building. The WKDB records that as the soldiers approached the building, they were fired upon. I find the record somewhat garbled. It is not clear when the 6 rounds were fired, and on one view it could suggest Mr. Salim and the occupants were engaged by 6 rounds. The oral and written statements are clear. Only 1 shot was fired by SO11. Further, Andrew Price, who gave written and oral evidence to me, impressed me as a witness of truth and reliability. In paragraph 8 of his statement, he stated, "I remember hearing large caliber rounds fired from what I believe was an AK-47, followed by 1 lower caliber round from a rifle, 5.56, which used to be called an SA-80. He repeated this in his oral evidence. He was clear that the shots came from within the house after the building had been entered. I have no reason to doubt that his experience in Northern Ireland had familiarized him with the distinctive fire from an AK-47. SO13 recalled, "As I moved towards the front door of room 1, I heard a number of shots being fired from different locations inside the house. There was certainly at least 1 AK-47, and I also heard a single shot fired from an SA-80. SO14 stated that he heard a burst of automatic fire from the house from an AK-47 and then 2 or 3 rounds from an SA-80. He was, as been emphasized by the family, on his own evidence, some 20 to 30 meters away at the time. And whilst I accept he's been truthful in his recollection, it is not the most compelling evidence I've received of the time and circumstance of the firing of rounds. Major Routledge heard 2 or 3 rifle shots being fired, but thought they were fired from the roof of MZD's house. I've considered the following evidence. 1. SO11's account of the shooting has not remained wholly consistent insofar as it relates to the number of individuals encountered on the stairs and which of any of them was armed with a weapon. 2. In his initial statement made on the 6th of November 2003, SO11 stated that as he entered the second room of the house, he heard 5 shots of automatic fire coming from the stairwell. He moved into room 4 and saw 2 men armed with long-barreled weapons coming at speed down the stairwell. There was no time to issue a warning shot, and believing that a contact was underway, he fired 1 round at the first male, then turned his weapon on the second male, who dropped his weapon. 3. In his statement of the 6th of August 2015, SO11 stated that as he entered the first room, he heard 5 rounds of automatic fire, although he could not tell where the rounds were coming from. Or he could not tell where the rounds were coming from. 1 or both of the men were carrying long-barreled weapons. I cannot remember if it was both men. As he believed the life of himself and his men were in danger, he fired a shot at the first male on the stairs. He did not recall whether the first man had been running down the stairs when he shot him. In his statement of the 6th of November 2015, SO11 stated that the man he engaged was standing at the top of the stairwell holding a long-barreled weapon. There was a second man behind him also holding a weapon. He said that the first man's weapon was in his shoulder, but I'm not sure whether or not it was levelled to fire. Mr. Salim was standing on the landing just before the stairs, when he was shot. His weapon landed on the first floor landing. The second man put his weapon down on the first floor landing next to the stairs. In the course of the hearing on the 27th of November 2015, SO11 stated that no more than 5 or 6 seconds after entering the building, he heard 5 rounds of automatic fire from within the house. From the bottom of the staircase, he saw 2 males and 1 female on the landing. Both males were carrying long-barreled guns. The man who was engaged by SO11 was carrying his weapon in his shoulder. Says SO11 stated that he identified the threat as he saw it and neutralized it prior to any of the other Kingsmen seeing the threat. The Iraqi evidence was that there was no shooting from within the house other than the fire from SO11's SA-80 rifle when he engaged Mr. Salim. 7. There are conflicting accounts regarding the timing and location from which gunfire was heard by other soldiers. The WKDB states that 0033 hours, as the CS approached the building, they were fired upon. Major Routledge stated that he heard 2 or 3 shots fired from the roof of the building, but which did not appear to be aimed at the British forces. SO12's account was that either shortly before, as the gates of the house were opened, 2 automatic weapons were fired from the roof over the heads of the British forces. SO13 said that as he moved towards the front door of the house, he heard a number of shots being fired from different locations within the house. He was certain that he heard at least 1 AK firing, followed by a single shot from an SA-80. He was also adamant that the British forces were not fired upon outside the house, but only once they had entered. Andrew Price had a very clear recollection of hearing shots fired from 2 different weapons inside the house. Once they had gained entry to the house, I remember hearing large caliber rounds fired from what I believe was an AK-47, followed by 1 lower caliber round from a rifle 5.56, which was used to be called an SA-80. Before I was deployed to Northern Ireland, we received training whether we were fired at under control, so that we could tell what kind of weapons were being fired at us. I know what an AK-47 sounds like, as these used to be used a lot by the IRA. As an AK-47 is fired, you hear a crack, followed by a thump as the bullet goes past you. This is different to the sound from an SA-80 being fired, which gives off much less of a bang. I'm absolutely sure that after SO11 went into the house, I heard multiple shots from a high caliber gun, followed by a shot from a lower caliber gun. The shots all came from within the house, but I couldn't tell where they were directed." Close quote. SO14 was also clear in his recollection that he had heard the sound of AK-47 shots, followed by the sound of a 5.56mm SA-80 fire in return, immediately prior to someone calling for a medic. The PIR states that 2 males ran down the stairs, the first 2 with long-barreled weapons. Major Routledge and SO13 stated that Mr. Salim had an AK-47 lying beside him on the ground. It is evident that the British forces did not search the house for AK-47 shells or casings, nor did they examine the gun said to have been dropped by Mr. Salim to check whether it had been fired recently. Major Routledge accepted that it would have been prudent to examine the gun, which he saw lying next to Salim. However, he hadn't done so, and couldn't say whether any other soldier had. Although SO14 recalled seeing SO11 unloading a gun, SO11's evidence was he did not examine either of the AK-47s found in the house. Andrew Price stated that he thought he'd seen one of the Kingsmen handling an AK-47 in the building. However, he did not have a good recollection of this. SO11's account of the shooting has not remained wholly consistent insofar as it relates to the number of individuals encountered on the stairs and which of any of them was armed with a weapon. It's submitted on behalf of the family that the evidence should lead one to be sceptical about any shots being fired from the occupants of the house. In respect of whether Mr. Salim was carrying a weapon at the time that he was shot, that even if this were the case, such a weapon was not being brandished in such a way as to lead SO11 to reasonably believe that his life was in imminent danger. That SO11 was so psyched up by the briefing given by Major Routledge that he took no chances and acted immediately to neutralize Mr. Salim, regardless of whether his life was in danger or not. It is accepted by SO11 that he did not give a warning prior to engaging Mr. Salim. I'm satisfied from the weight of the evidence I have reviewed that as the soldiers entered the house, rounds from an AK-47 were fired. AIS and Mr. Salim were expecting the Al-Badanis and had armed themselves to protect the house and its occupants. It seems consistent and sensible for them to have fired rounds by way of warning to the Al-Badanis that they could expect an armed response. The circumstances as I have found them to be, namely the false information, the shots after entry, and an encounter with armed men on the stairs after entry, taken together was sufficient to have generated a belief in any reasonable trained soldier that his life could be in immediate danger. With the benefit of hindsight, one can ask whether a warning should have been given. But split-second decisions are called for in these circumstances, and hindsight is no guide to a fair assessment of the facts. SO11 was entitled to act in self-defense, and I have concluded that sufficient circumstances did exist to justify the belief on his part that he was in danger. The ROE provided, quote, "Nothing in these ROE shall be construed as limiting a commander's or individual's inherent right of self-defense as provided for under national and international law." Heading: Whether there was an unjustifiable delay in providing an ambulance to treat Mr. Salim. The British forces did not take an ambulance with them on the search and arrest operation. SO11 stated they did not have one at Camp Cherokee. The main aid post and ambulances were located at the Shat al-Arab Hotel, which was between 5 to 8 minutes drive away. The PIR records that the house was cleared at approximately 12:30 a.m. on the 6th of November 2003. At approximately 12:56 a.m., the OC calls forward a BFA from Camp Cherokee, and the casualty is taken to Czech Military Hospital. SO14's evidence was that I immediately asked for my ambulance, as I did have one at camp, but there was a problem with getting that to us. I would say that it took about 40 minutes from my first treating the injured male to getting him into the ambulance. At the public hearing, he stated that he asked for an ambulance to be called from the Shat Al Arab Hotel, which he would have expected to take around 25 minutes. However, he felt like he was waiting for a very long time, and when it did arrive, it was not the ambulance he had asked for, but was his vehicle from Camp Cherokee. He estimated that it took about 40 minutes and an hour for the vehicle to arrive. Major Routledge's evidence was that it took 15 to 20 minutes from the time that Mr. Salim was shot to an ambulance being called. Although you would have expected an ambulance to take only 10 to 15 minutes to arrive from the Shat Al Arab, it in fact took between 30 to 40 minutes. He said he did not believe, as contended by Mr. Salim's family, that it had taken up to 2 hours for the ambulance to arrive, and thought it had been in an hour. The evidence of the family members was that the total time between Mr. Salim being shot and being taken away in an ambulance was around 2 hours. During this delay, FZD was kissing the hands of the soldiers, begging them to take Mr. Salim to hospital. There was a delay of between 15 to 20 minutes between Mr. Salim being shot and an ambulance being called. The British Forces evidence is that it took from between 40 minutes to an hour from the ambulance being called to it arriving at the house. The Iraqi witnesses contend that it was around 2 hours. As I've referred to earlier in the report, SO14 expressed the view that Mr. Salim's wound was survivable if treated within the golden hour. There's no evidence which either supports or refutes this suggestion. It's submitted on behalf of Mr. Salim's family that the delay in the ambulance arriving to take Mr. Salim away could have been avoided if, one, an ambulance had been organised prior to setting off on the search and arrest operation, two, an ambulance driver had been placed on standby, and three, the ambulance was properly kitted out with life-saving equipment and a doctor. Further, that these measures should have been in place in any event, in case any soldiers were injured during the operation. However, although I have had reservations about the accuracy of some of the contents of the logs, I believe that as timing, they have a defendability, not as to the accuracy of the precise time, but the time lag between the entries. I have no doubt that the wait for the ambulance to arrive at a time when the family would have been extremely anxious for his well-being was an agonizing period for the family. But I do not find the evidence supports a conclusion that it was longer than 1 hour before it arrived. Recommendations. I have no formal recommendations to make, but I have been asked by MZD to consider whether there are any points which I can draw to the Secretary of State's attention, bearing in mind the highly unusual circumstances of this case, whereby the Army has caused a family to be torn apart from their loved one through no fault of their own. I'm asked to have in mind that anything I can say will certainly go a long way towards trying to bring closure to this traumatic experience for this very unfortunate family. There are a few points which I will make, not for the particular attention of the Secretary of State, but because they might help the family return to a balanced and rational understanding of what this brought about. I'm fully aware of the horror and anguish which the family experienced on that night. I have no doubt that being forcefully subjected by armed soldiers to physical restraint, accompanied by shouting, noise and vigorous searching of the house, all of which took place as Mr. Salim, seriously wounded, waited for the ambulance, was a deeply traumatic experience. It's not disputed that MZD and AIS were placed in plastic cuffs and taken outside, quite probably at gunpoint. The exercise of such force as would have been necessary on the part of the soldiers to carry out the house clearance exercise must have been alien to the family, and inevitably would have been a terrifying and unpleasant experience for them. It was bound to generate anger, anguish, and profound considerations about the appropriate measures and legal avenues which might lead to justice and assist closure. Unfortunately, the family did not have the benefit of any measured and balanced legal advice. It is regrettable that it was not until the IFI sent the documents to MZD in October 2015 that he had the opportunity to consider the documentary record prepared by the military. Had he seen the strength of the evidential record, he may have hesitated before he committed himself to the strategy urged upon him by the al-Badanis, which was supported by the creation of a false document to blame the British forces. The legal imperative of an Article 2 inquiry, which was required under the European Convention of Human Rights, has been met. But in my view, it has been the pursuit of compensation which has prevented closure and given oxygen to anger and bitterness. MZD had a more balanced approach when the incident occurred, and he met with Major Routledge. His meetings with Major Routledge caused him to regard him as a decent man, and I respected him. The al-Badanis made protagonists of natural allies and persuaded the family to take a course which has delayed closure. A return to an assessment freed from the malign influence of the al-Badanis will, in my judgment, be a step towards closure.